Joining me right now is our very own Law and Crime, Aaron Keller. Aaron, thanks for joining me today.
Vincent, how are you?
I'm well, man. So Jame Colley, right? We've been covering this trial, and I always wondered, why is this even going to court, right? We had witnesses to escape. We have everything I think we need. We have the evidence, the physical evidence. We have 911 calls. Why do you think this even went to trial?
Well, look, I don't think the prosecutor was going to budge on any kind of a plea deal for this defendant. They knew that they had solid evidence to indicate that there was premeditation. When you have premeditation in Florida, you can seek the death penalty. That's what they sought here. I don't think they were going to offer anything for a plea because the case was strong enough to bring it on those top charges. They were going to get a pretty serious charge on the evidence that they had, and a very likely conviction. So they went for it. And of course, the question is whether the jury is going to agree that this should be life or this should be the death penalty.
Well, I'm glad you brought up premeditation because we heard testimony that there was the incident of ransacking the house just prior to this shooting. It appeared that James was lying in wait, waiting for his wife, Amanda, and Mr. Dobberly to make entry into that home. He followed them into that home, so I think the premeditation is definitely there. There were family members that knew there were issues going on with James and his state of mind prior to this shooting. And speaking of, let's take a listen to Crystal Colley Boatwright, who is actually the defendant's sister in this case. Take a listen. Hey, that was testimony from Crystal Colley Boatwright, Jame Colley's sister in this case, talking about his state of mind and things that were going on just prior to the shooting. Joining me right now, along with Aaron Keller, is David D. Pietro, a former prosecutor down in Florida. David, how are you, sir?
Hey, how are you guys doing?
Excellent. So what's your take on this Jame Colley murder trial as a prosecutor? I think the prosecution has a pretty solid case here. I mean, we've seen where, what we thought were a pretty solid case go awry, but I think the prosecution has everything they need here. What say you?
Yeah, this is definitely, in the way of evidence, it's a home run for the prosecution. They have everything they want. They have eyewitnesses, they have audio, they have, everything that they need to tie it together. Voicemails beforehand, court proceedings for injunction relief beforehand. This is I would predict, a very easy win for the prosecution. The death penalty portion, that's interesting what our society's sort of doing with the death penalty, making it much harder to get a full unanimous agreement from a jury on the death penalty. We had one here in Broward County where a deputy was killed about 10 years ago, and they convicted him pretty easily of the defendants on the murder, but they did come back on the death penalty. So it's interesting to see.
Now, Aaron, David mentioned text messages, but and voicemails. Listen, I've been married twice. I've sent some pretty crazy text messages. Doesn't make me a killer. I've gotten those text messages as well. So can we use that as part of this premeditation in this case to paint the overall picture?
That's where the defense went with its ultimate strategy here. First, the defense was trying to say that the defendant is on this cocktail. He's got multiple prescription medications in his system. He then goes apparently to get a beer before the shooting happened, and they were trying to go there with that, okay? They abandoned it and said instead that what this guy really did was second-degree depraved heart murder, not premeditated murder, and they were really trying to get the jury to hone in on those definitions. That was the defense strategy, and given the evidence, that wasn't a horrendously bad strategy, I don't think. David, what do you think?
I think with the evidence, yeah, you get to a point with these kinds of cases where, Aaron, where I agree with you that you're just trying to save your client's life. I hope they got a colloquy on the record, that this was going to be argued. Otherwise, the defendant is going to argue one day that he never agreed to this strategy and his lawyer failed him under Florida's 3.850 rule, ineffective assistance of counsel. So it's an interesting argument, but it could backfire if the judge and the defense attorney don't take all the proper measures. Even the prosecutor might even want to get that kind of colloquy.
All right, we are actually going to jump to a quick break. We'll be right back with more of the Jame Colley murder trial in Florida. Stay tuned. Welcome back. That was testimony from Amy Mason. Let me toss it to you, Aaron. You and I were watching this here in the studio. What do you think? I mean, we heard her talk about the development of this relationship, but more importantly, the text messages the night before, and nothing seemed to rise. So what do you think was going through her head when she heard that James Colley, her boyfriend, who she talked about marrying, killed his wife?
She had to have been in anguish, and I think that you see that. She's trying to keep her composure at one point during the testimony, but she's got to be second-guessing him. She's got to be second-guessing herself. Like, what did I get myself into? Right. I mean, I would assume that that's the way that she's got to be reacting to it. But talk about someone who's probably sitting there playing these events over and over again in her head. Should I have noticed a sign? Should I have taken steps to stop something? Or how is it that I was in a relationship with this person who then went on to allegedly commit these acts?
Exactly. David, let me toss to you, because Aaron brings up a good point. I mean, how did this guy hide it so well that Amy wouldn't have known anything? And will that play into the outcome of this case?
I think she should go to church, because she's lucky he didn't lose it on her. I think, if you look at all the facts and circumstances of the case, it seems like more of somebody in a complete delusional rage than probably someone was born as a sociopathic murderer. So I think this is more somebody. It was a crime of passion and emotion that was driving the ultimate intent of the crime. So that's my hunch and my guess on it. So, but she's got to be thinking to herself, like, how did I get intertwined in this? I'm testifying in court, and maybe she has a lot of mixed emotions about everything, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's probably one reason I stay single. Let's hear more testimony from Amy Mason. And that's more testimony from Amy Mason, who was the girlfriend of James Colley at the time. Aaron, we heard some text messages there, or we heard about text messages there. I love you, and then there was the thing about was he done with court between 8:20 and 10:30. And to me, I think if this guy could hide this that well, that really plays a lot into his psyche and the type of person we're actually dealing with.
Yeah, this is a sort of witness that could play into the defense theory, could play into the state's theory. The state could be saying, hey, look, he's plotting this and he's putting up a face to someone close to him so he doesn't send out any warnings. The defense could take this and turn around and say this was a snap crime of passion.
Absolutely. We are going to take a quick break. Go refill your coffee. Much more to come on the James Colley murder trial in Florida. Stay tuned. This is the Law and Crime Network. Hey, that was testimony from Christine Keegan, a CSI tech who investigated and inspected the room where James Colley was staying inside his sister's home. I want to toss out to David DiPietro. You're a former prosecutor, but I'm going to play devil's advocate here, because one of the things I said during the last break with Aaron, you go in my room, you're going to find guns, because I'm a gun buff. I'm a former police officer. You're going to find bullets. You're going to find a gun case. Just that in itself doesn't really say anything regarding this shooting. So how, as a prosecutor, do you tie that to the motive into this crime? Yeah,
so Florida is a pretty, when I say conservative, you could use the word conservative or liberal, any way you want to put it, when it comes to gun ownership. 1.1 million concealed weapons permit holders in the state of Florida. So, and it's a very much a pro-gun state. So the having possessing a firearm is one in 5 people probably do own a firearm in the state. So that in itself doesn't do very much. So you have to tie the firearm into the crime, because the ownership alone, it's not going to really be something, especially in the area of the state where they are, which is a little more conservative part of the state. Probably more people carry firearms than in many other parts of the country.
So, Aaron, David made a good point. Tie the firearm to the crime. So how do we do that? How do investigators do that to say, yes, this was the firearm and these were the bullets used for this crime?
Well, look, I mean, in this case, they had testimony from the defendant's sister, I think it was, who turned around and said, look, I left these weapons in a vehicle and I was on vacation. I didn't realize he was going to go and try to get access to them. So, it seems, though, or it smells like the kind of case where prosecutors are trying to say, look at the volume of the weapons here. Look at the sheer volume of this. Try to scare jurors or something like that. It almost looks like it's that kind of a case.
And maybe they're trying to look at the totality of everything here involved, right? You have the bullets, you have the gun casing, you have the boxes of ammo that we saw there in those pictures, along with the text messages, the phone calls, and things of that nature, the testimony from the girlfriend. So maybe prosecutors are trying to paint the totality of the evidence, as police like to use that term a lot, to say that, yes, this is the guy who did it. Here's the proof that he did it. Here's the physical proof, the bullets, the gun casings, and things of that nature, to paint this bigger picture for the jury. I think that's what they're doing here.
Oh, yeah, certainly. I mean, they're trying to add this all up and say, look, the guy had this in his bedroom. He had access to these weapons in the sister's vehicle. He had these statements to say the night before. He had these statements to say to his departing wife leading up to this. It all adds up to a premeditated situation.
Absolutely. We're going to take a quick break. I bet somewhere in this country there's a dog that's waiting to be walked right now. Go do that, and we will be right back here on the Law and Crime Network. Stay tuned. And that was still testimony from David Kazi. Still with me, Aaron in studio and David DiPietro via Skype. Aaron, let me toss to you. We heard some testimony there from Jame Colley, or from that investigator there, about some text messages from James that said, just know there are things that you can never take back. You are a bad person. And to me, there's this allegation that she was seeing this Lamar guy, but, and there you see the defendant on the screen. To me, it sounds like this guy had a mentality of, well, if I can't have you, nobody can. What say you, Aaron?
Oh, I think that those text messages were some of the more calm messages that came out of him. Because, look, one of the accusations from the prosecution, especially on closing argument, was that he referred to his departing wife as a, quote, effing promiscuous woman. He used a different word for it. And then fired the fatal shots. So the last thing that she probably heard was him berating her. This guy really wanted to inflict some serious psychological pain on his departing wife, and I think that some of what we just heard was nowhere near the worst of what ultimately came out.
Right. I don't think we actually heard any previous testimony about domestic violence, but to me, these are the signs of an abuser who is very controlling in the relationship. Even when the relationship is over, there's a very famous case that took place way back in 1994. There was allegations of abuse in that relationship, and we see how that ended. We are actually going to take a quick break here on the Law and Crime Network. Go refill your coffee, walk that dog. Stay tuned. More of the Jame Colley murder trial here on the Law and Crime Network. Hey, thank you so much for that, Anthony. Still with me, David DiPietro. Before we get back into the Jame Colley murder trial in Florida, David, I want to ask you about these orders of protection. I know you've dealt with those in the past, and I've dealt with those, of course, on the law enforcement side. And usually when I respond, it's usually too late because the defendant has usually fled the scene, he's gone. But tell our viewers what an order of protection is and the intent of an order of protection. Sure.
So Florida, on domestic violence cases, if you reside together, if the officer arrives and the suspects are still there, or one or more will be arrested if there's probable cause. There's no discretion in the statute. So if an officer finds probable cause, somebody's going to get arrested. Now, if for civil, what they call temporary restraining orders in Florida, anyone can basically go down to the courthouse for no fee and 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because the clerks always have to be open for this, and request an order of temporary restraining order. There's always a judge 24 hours available to review it. If the order meets the four corners of the statute, that there was a unlawful striking or there's stalking or whatever the predicate is, the judge will issue what's called a temporary restraining order and set a hearing. Usually 14, I think it's about 14 days out, it's required by the statute. If the judge finds there insufficient facts, the judge will still issue a hearing and have a hearing, but will not issue the temporary restraining order. when there's actually a trial on the fact. So the temporary is just as strong as the regular restraining order if it's ultimately given. So, but the defendant needs to be served. The way the defendant's served on it is usually law enforcement will have it. The victim will have it, and law enforcement will always have a copy of it so they could serve it on them. So once they're served, the temporary restraining order is in place, and there needs to be a trial on whether there's going to be a permanent restraining order. If that restraining order is violated, it can rise to the level of a felony at that point. So it's not a misdemeanor interaction; it becomes a felony activity. So it's many states that follow this method. It's a way to encourage people to file these restraining orders for their protection.
Right, and we know that Jame Colley actually was at an order of protection hearing that morning. But my question really quick to you, David, is why are the laws not as strict when dealing with order of protection? Usually if you violate it, it's 5 to 10 days in jail, which to a lot of people is not a lot of time, and plus it gives you time to stew. Why do you think these laws aren't tougher for violating orders of protection?
They're pretty tough in Florida. If you violate, most of the time it could be rise to the level of felony. If it's a misdemeanor and there's a domestic violence act, you're held in custody with no, I can't speak for the whole state, but I can speak for Broward County. You're held in custody, no bond, until you see a judge. So if you're a victim, you're a legitimate victim, you can go see a judge before they even get a bond. And you can't, because you can't hold people in forever on
right.
crimes that don't rise to the level of homicide.
Right.
So you can go see the judge and get the reasonable restrictions, and there could be ankle monitors. There's a whole lot of things. So a lot of this is law enforcement has to educate when they interact with victims, sort of be sort of like lawyers or advisors, and explain what resources are available and what needs to be done.
Absolutely. And speaking of orders of protection and attorneys, let's hear from Kyle Bedrin, who is actually Jame Colley's attorney involving this order of protection. Let's take a listen to what he said the state of mind Jame Colley was that day. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. We're still covering a Jame Colley murder trial in Florida, a death penalty case where he's on trial for the murder of his wife, Amanda, and her friend, Lindy Dobbins. But there's a twist to this case. There are 2 surviving witnesses, Rachel Hendricks and Lamar Darberly. Still with me, David DiPietro, former prosecutor in the state of Florida. With this aspect of surviving witnesses, how big is this in the prosecution of this case? We have DNA, we have these shell casings, but how crucial is the testimony of this surviving witness?
Yeah, homicide cases are always difficult because most of the time the victim is no longer with us and cannot testify, so cannot positively identify the assailant or the defendant.
Mm-hmm.
We have witnesses like this and who are also victims. It really bolsters up the case, and there's no evidence of a self-defense struggle or anything like that. Because sometimes having witnesses, they can turn into unindicted co-conspirators or unindicted co-defendants. So I think in this case it really helps from an evidentiary standpoint.
Absolutely, and I think it plays into the emotions of the jury as well to be able to see that surviving witness tell their story and tell that terror, that horror that went on inside that home, inside that Florida home that Amanda was staying with at the time, that she used to share with her husband, James. We want to listen actually to Rachel Hendricks. She is one of the surviving witnesses in this case in the Jame Colley murder trial. Take a listen. That was pretty compelling testimony from Rachel Hendricks, a surviving witness in the Jame Colley murder trial. She testified to Lindy Dobbins, who was actually one of the victims in this case, hiding in the closet behind a dresser drawer. She talked about the confrontation with Jame Colley and his wife, Amanda, in the bathroom. Here in studio with me, Aaron Keller. Aaron, I think, you know, we have everything we need here, but I think the most compelling piece of this testimony is that Lindy, who was actually killed, called 911. So now we have this recording of what went down in that house that day.
Yeah, there were a couple of recordings, and that's what allowed, in part, prosecutors to try to stitch together the exact scene of events. And look, if I'm understanding this, there was a shot to the wife, Amanda, and then he goes for the other victim. He's firing more shots, and he goes back to the wife, calls her the effing bleepity bleep,
Right.
and then starts firing the fatal shots, unloads one gun, and then picks up another one and keeps shooting it, as I understand it from the closing arguments. So, you know, that sets the stage for some kind of premeditated rage. That's where the prosecutor was going with this case. That's why it was the top murder charge. The defense turned around and said, no, 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 this is depraved heart killing, but the amount of ammunition used is one of the elements the prosecution tried to use to say this was planned.
Absolutely. And keep in mind, too, she was shot 9 times. She being Amanda, she was shot 9 times. So that tells you the brutality that was going on inside of that home when Jame Colley was in there. You heard from Rachel Hendricks, the surviving witness. She testified about how everyone went to hide. The thing is heating up in the Jame Colley murder trial. We're going to take a quick break and be back with more testimony in the Jame Colley murder trial in Florida. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. Just before the break, we heard testimony from Rachel Hendricks, a surviving victim in this Jame Colley murder trial, who's on trial for killing his wife, Amanda, and her friend, Lindy. There was also Lamar Dubberly inside that home, who was having a relationship with Amanda. If you have not seen this yet, there's actually footage of Lamar and Rachel escaping the home. There you can see, I believe that is Lamar Dubberly at a high rate of speed exiting that house. Here in just a second, we should see Rachel Hendricks as well. There she is on your screen, escaping that home. So we can only imagine the terror that was going on inside that home. Still with me, David DiPietro. David, really quick, I think that video really is truly telling on, you know, the amount of fear that happened inside that home on that day when Amanda and Lindy were killed. What say you?
Oh, no question about it. So it's extremely compelling. So this case is one that's it's fascinating to watch because in the sense that we're usually plucking away, did he do it, did he not do it? This one's pretty obvious that he did it. It's just a matter of the severity of the penalty. So all good evidence that's coming in for the prosecution.
Yeah, so like I said before the break, things are heating up here in this Jame Colley murder trial. We want to hear more testimony from Rachel Hendricks, again, a surviving witness in this case. Take a listen. Still hearing testimony from Rachel Hendricks, a surviving victim in this murder trial of Jame Colley. Again, his wife Amanda and her friend Lindy were killed. Still with me, Aaron and David. David, I want to toss to you. We saw that footage just a second ago, them running out of the house. She said she finally got into a mutual friend, a neighbor's house, and was able to call 911. And as jurors, we watch these shows like Law and Order and things of that nature. They love drama. So do you think that provided enough drama for this jury to see them running out of the house and then to get into another person's house to call 911?
Yeah, I think so. I think the whole story is dramatic, and it's definitely reached the tone of drama and it tying all the pieces together. So I think the intended effect was had with this part of the evidence.
Absolutely, Aaron. I don't know how to say this without offending someone, but what do you think of the rate of speed that Lamar Dubberly ran out of that house? I mean, do you think he was that afraid, or do you think he knew he was a target as well? And there you can see on the screen, he is moving at a high rate of speed there, almost
well,
like
look,
track star.
I mean, if the accusations are true and he's getting with the wife, and then the wife's departing husband shows up with guns, I think anybody is going to be getting out of there as fast as his legs will carry him, and that's what we just saw.
Right.
I mean, that's the kind of call that if you were cruising around in a police cruiser in your law enforcement days, that, you know, you don't want to be getting in that situation. You don't even want to be getting in that situation.
Definitely don't want to be in that situation, and I don't know how I would have reacted in that situation. Speaking of Lamar,
if you had gotten a call to show up and respond to that sort of thing, that's the most volatile situation that you could possibly imagine.
Absolutely. Speaking of Lamar Dubberly, let's take a listen to some of his testimony about the Jame Colley murder trial. Take a listen. That was testimony from Lamar Dubberly, again, a surviving victim and witness in this murder trial, Jame Colley murder trial in Florida, death penalty case. He talked about hearing a pop, which we learned was a gunshot. He talked about seeing a bullet hole in the wall just prior to running out of the home. Still with me here in studio, Aaron Keller. We're getting down to the wire here, Aaron, but I think this talk about the pop and seeing the bullet hole pretty much tells the jury everything they need to know about what happened in this case here inside that home.
It starts to develop it. I think that the full picture of it comes after he splits and goes peeling down the street at full gallop, because the 911 calls that were made by the people who are still in the house capture the conversation between the defendant and his wife, and him calling her all sorts of bad names before delivering the final shots. And that's one of the elements that became contested in the closing arguments. Is it signs that the defendant was going off in a fit of rage, okay, more like second-degree murder, or was it indicative of some kind of premeditated plan, first-degree murder carrying the death penalty, second-degree murder doesn't in Florida? That was the back and forth between the defense and the prosecution.
Right. And we're also looking at 2 counts of attempted murder, because we had the 2 victims that actually escaped. And you could hear testimony where Jame Colley was asking, where is he being Lamar Dubberly, before he fled the house. I do believe a verdict is in this case. Let's get to the courtroom and take a listen to the jury. The jury has spoken in the Jame Colley murder trial. You just heard guilty on all charges. He was charged and indicted on several charges, but of course the most serious of those, Aaron, being the 2 counts of premeditated felony murder, which he was found guilty of, the 2 counts of attempted murder that he was found guilty of. I do believe that the court will resume this coming Monday to start the sentencing phase in this case. Of course, this is a death penalty case in the state of Florida. What say you about his chances of life in prison versus the death penalty?
I don't think people are going to look too kind to this guy, because, look, the defense tactic during the trial failed. Some of the aggravating circumstances seem to have been laid out by the state during the case in chief. Okay, we may get a little bit more of a window into the rancor between the former wife and the defendant. We'll certainly hear some kind of mitigating testimony. Anything that ever happened that was bad or wrong or that hurt the defendant's feelings, all of that's got to come in. It has to come in. The appeals courts have ruled pretty much anything that could swing at least one juror against a death sentence has to come in. They'll flip convictions if it doesn't come in. So jurors are going to have to listen to all that and then make their decision.
Right, absolutely. And it only takes that one juror to, make that decision, whether life or death. Again, the court will resume Monday for the sentencing phase of Jame Colley. He was just found guilty on all charges. Of course, the murder of his wife and her best friend being the 2 most serious charges, in the attempted murder of Lamar Dubberly and Rachel Hendricks in this case. We will, of course, cover that sentencing hearing here on the Law and Crime Network. Until then, we appreciate you for watching. And as always, we thank you and good night.